In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates and Tigris rivers carved life into the land, the sacred feminine was revered with a devotion that bordered on obsession. Women, in theory, held the keys to divine mysteries, embodying the nurturing yet terrifying power of goddesses like Inanna and Ishtar. Temples rose like monuments to their celestial authority, adorned with intricate carvings and flowing depictions of women as both creators and destroyers, their divine beauty intoxicating and their power unquestionable. Yet beneath the golden glow of ritual lamps, beneath the incense that swirled through sacred halls, a darker reality festered, invisible to the casual observer. The very reverence for women, for their supposed closeness to the gods, became the mechanism of their control. Every gesture, every initiation, every whispered prayer was calibrated to assert dominance over the feminine spirit, transforming divine worship into a tool of subjugation. Women were celebrated in new hymn and myth, yet the same songs that exalted their celestial power also mapped the boundaries of obedience and submission they were expected to honor. The tension between veneration and victimization was woven into the very fabric of Mesopotamian culture, a paradox that allowed priests and rulers to cloak coercion in sanctity. Here, a woman's value was never hers alone. It was a currency for spiritual economy, exchanged in rituals that promised divine favor but exacted an unseen price. The Baoyu sacred feminine was not free. It was shackled by gold, revered by society while enslaved in practice, made to dance in ceremonies that glorified the gods while eroding the human dignity of those who embodied them. As we peer into the candlelit sanctuaries of ancient cities, it becomes chillingly clear. The power ascribed to women was never theirs to wield. It was a gilded cage, a labyrinth of devotion and control, a stage on which their freedom was sacrificed to the whims of men who claimed divine authority. And yet, this is only the beginning, the prelude to the deeper horrors hidden in the rituals that followed, where sacred rites became instruments of exploitation, and the women of Mesopotamia were drawn into a world of veneration that disguised the cruelest forms of bondage. Comment below if this revelation shocks you, like if you feel the weight of history, and subscribe to uncover the next layers of darkness that these ancient cults concealed. The temples of Mesopotamia, outwardly majestic and serene, concealed a grim truth beneath their ornate facades. They were not merely centers of worship, but instruments of control, their towering walls and shadowed corridors forming prisons as much as sacred spaces. Women who entered these hallowed halls often did so under the promise of spiritual elevation, yet the reality they encountered was far more sinister. Once inside, their lives were meticulously regulated, every movement observed, every interaction monitored, every word weighed against the strict codes dictated by the priests. The architecture itself seemed designed to enforce submission, with narrow passageways and inner chambers that restricted freedom while amplifying the sense of awe and intimidation. Rituals that were proclaimed as sacred guidance became subtle forms of manipulation. The daily routines, the offerings, the ceremonial cleansings, all served as tools to instill obedience. Women learned quickly that deviation, however small, could result in punishment disguised as divine correction, a physical or emotional chastisement framed as the will of the gods. The priests, revered for their supposed connection to the divine, wielded this authority mercilessly, crafting a hierarchy in which women were simultaneously venerated and constrained, exalted in public ritual but stripped of autonomy in private. Their bodies became instruments of devotion, their choices bound to the needs of the cult, their identities subsumed by the roles imposed upon them. This duality, the public reverence versus private subjugation, was a recurring theme in the sacred architecture, the inscriptions on the walls, and the encoded laws that governed temple life. Each corridor and chamber became a lesson in obedience, a testament to the clever cruelty hidden beneath the veneer of holiness. What was presented as sanctuary was in truth a theater of control, where freedom was an illusion, and the line between devotion and domination blurred to the point of invisibility. In these spaces, the women of Mesopotamia were not merely participants in religious rites. They were pawns in a meticulously constructed system designed to sanctify male power while exploiting the very essence of femininity. The grandeur of the temples masked the chains that held them, and every incense-laden ritual reinforced the boundaries of their captivity, leaving an indelible mark on their lives and on the history of sacred femininity itself. Within the sanctuaries of Mesopotamia, the rituals designed to train women into obedience were both intricate and insidious. These ceremonies, often cloaked in the language of spiritual enlightenment, demanded unwavering compliance, conditioning participants to accept roles that were carefully constructed by the male priesthood. From the moment a girl entered the temple, she was subjected to a regimen that blurred devotion with discipline. Each step, each chant, each symbolic gesture was meticulously orchestrated to instill a deep-seated sense of duty, not to herself, but to the cult and the authority of those who controlled it. The rituals often began with purification rites, where women were bathed and adorned in sacred garments, signaling not freedom, but submission to the ritualistic hierarchy. They were instructed in the language of the gods, taught to recite prayers that reinforced obedience and humility, and guided through ceremonies that demanded physical and emotional endurance. The more they mastered these rites, the more tightly they were bound to the expectations of the temple, their personal will gradually eroded by repetition and ritual precision. Initiations into higher ranks within the temple appeared to promise empowerment, but in truth, they were gateways to deeper levels of control, each layer demanding more compliance and more sacrifice. What the outside world interpreted as devotion or spiritual prowess was, in reality, a sophisticated mechanism of psychological manipulation. Women became vessels for ritual, their autonomy surrendered under the guise of holiness. Those who faltered were reminded of their place through subtle punishments or social ostracization, ensuring that fear and reverence worked hand in hand to secure submission. The priests exploited the duality of praise and reprimand, crafting a cycle where women learned to crave approval, yet feared transgression, a psychological cage disguised as sacred practice. In this calculated environment, the sacred feminine was simultaneously exalted and constrained, the cult presenting an illusion of honor while systematically stripping away independence. These rituals left a lasting imprint, not only on the women who endured them, but on the legacy of Mesopotamian religion itself, a civilization where devotion was inseparable from domination, and the line between spiritual elevation and enforced servitude was deliberately obscured. Beneath the ceremonial grandeur of Mesopotamian temples, the male priesthood held a power both sacred and terrifying. These men, claiming divine authority, dictated every aspect of a woman's life within the temple walls, their control masked by rituals that appeared holy but were designed to dominate. They determined who could ascend in the hierarchy, who would participate in the most revered ceremonies, and who would be marginalized or punished for perceived transgressions. Women were often reduced to symbols of divine will, their bodies and spirits, instruments for the priestly agenda, their individuality erased in the service of male authority. The more revered the priest, the more extensive his influence over the women in his charge, creating a system where devotion was inseparable from exploitation. There were moments of public exaltation, where women performed sacred dances or chants, seemingly honored and respected, yet these displays were carefully choreographed to reinforce the priest's control, to remind both participants and observers that the real power resided in the hands of men. Intimate knowledge of sacred rites, once a source of empowerment, was transformed into a tool of manipulation. The priests held secrets that allowed them to bend the women to their will, controlling not only behavior, but belief. It is chilling to realize that what appears as spiritual guidance often concealed coercion, and acts framed as divine instruction were, in fact, instruments of domination. The duality of reverence and oppression was deliberate. Elevate to enthrall, celebrate to subdue, honor to bind. These men, cloaked in the sanctity of ritual, became arbiters of destiny, shaping lives under the guise of holiness. Reflecting on these abuses, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. The sacred and the sinister were inseparable, intertwined in a system that valorized male authority while masking oppression with the glitter of divine ceremony. Share your thoughts in the comments below on how power and devotion can become dangerous when left unchecked in the hands of a few. Among the most controversial practices of Mesopotamian cults was the ritual known as hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. Ostensibly, this union between a priest or king and a temple woman was meant to symbolically unite heaven and earth, ensuring fertility and divine favor for the city. Yet beneath the ritual's celestial veneer lay a profound exploitation. Women chosen for these ceremonies were often young and vulnerable, their selection framed as an honor, but their reality steeped in coercion. Once the ritual began, personal consent was secondary to religious expectation. The woman's body became the medium through which divine blessing was channeled, her autonomy subordinated to the needs of the cult and the desire of those in power. The celebrations, replete with feasting, dance, and symbolic union, masked a deeper truth. These sacred marriages were structured to maintain hierarchical control and reinforce male dominance, transforming what was portrayed as a spiritual privilege into a form of ritualized subjugation. Many women entered these unions with reverence, believing they were fulfilling a divine purpose, yet the cost was steep. They were often subjected to repeated ceremonies, their lives circumscribed by the temple's expectations, their identities defined by the roles imposed upon them. The line between veneration and exploitation blurred, as the sacred narrative justified actions that, outside the religious context, would be recognized as abuse. Through hieros gamos, the cults of Mesopotamia demonstrated their ability to sanctify control, to cloak oppression in the language of divine will, and to ensure that women's bodies and spirits were instruments of ritual and power rather than autonomous beings. The disturbing reality is that what was celebrated as a divine connection often concealed a deeper, darker purpose: the systematic domination of the sacred feminine, performed under the guise of holiness, leaving a legacy of ritualized exploitation that echoes through the annals of history. In the rigidly structured world of Mesopotamian temples, punishment was the shadow lurking behind every ritual. Women who defied the prescribed codes, whether by questioning the authority of the priests, resisting the sacred marriages, or stepping outside the confines of temple life, faced consequences that were both cruel and public. Transgressions were interpreted as affronts to the gods themselves, giving the male priesthood both moral and spiritual justification for harsh reprimands. Punishments ranged from ritualized shaming to physical chastisement, always executed in a manner that reinforced fear and submission. Theological texts and temple records reveal a chilling calculus. Obedience was rewarded with fleeting privileges and recognition, while defiance brought isolation, social stigma, and, in extreme cases, ritualized violence. Taboos surrounding sexuality, speech, and conduct became tools for surveillance and control, ensuring that women internalized their roles as vessels of devotion and instruments of the cult. Even those who occupied respected positions, such as priestesses or temple attendants, were not immune. Their elevated status merely exposed them to more intricate and insidious forms of control. The narrative of divine punishment blurred the line between the sacred and the sinister, as women were compelled to perceive their suffering as a necessary part of fulfilling their spiritual purpose. Resistance was not just a personal act. It threatened the entire system, prompting reprisals that left lasting psychological scars and perpetuated a cycle of subjugation. The temples, while appearing as sanctuaries, functioned as mechanisms of surveillance and correction, where fear was institutionalized and compliance enforced under the guise of holiness. In understanding these punishments, we confront the stark reality that devotion in Mesopotamia was inseparable from domination, and the women who dared to assert autonomy were often met with the full weight of a system designed to suppress them. Even among the women of Mesopotamia who held positions of spiritual authority, such as prophets or oracles, freedom was an illusion carefully masked by ritual prestige. These women were celebrated as conduits to the divine, their words believed to carry the will of the gods, yet they remained tightly bound by the rigid hierarchies of the temples. The power they appeared to wield was always mediated, always controlled, and often exploited by the male priesthood for their own agendas. Oracular visions were interpreted through the lens of male authority, and prophecies were shaped to reinforce existing structures rather than to empower the women delivering them. The irony was profound. Those who spoke with the voice of divinity were often silenced when their messages threatened the status quo. Every revelation, every pronouncement was a delicate negotiation between obedience and defiance, with consequences carefully calibrated to preserve control. Some women attempted to navigate this treacherous terrain by aligning themselves with influential figures, yet even strategic alliances could not shield them from the ever-present mechanisms of oversight and manipulation. The temples, while venerating these women publicly, subjected them privately to constant scrutiny and subtle coercion, ensuring that reverence never translated into autonomy. Their sacred roles became both armor and cage, a paradox that exemplified the complexities of female existence in Mesopotamian cult life. The stories of these prophetesses and oracles remind us that visibility and influence do not necessarily equate to freedom, and that spiritual authority can be weaponized as a tool of control. Reflect on the tragic irony of these women's lives in the comments below, and share your thoughts on how power can be both granted and withheld in the guise of devotion. The legacy of misogyny in Mesopotamia was codified not only in practice, but in text. Hymns, myths, and legal codes meticulously documented the limitations placed upon women, transforming spiritual narratives into instruments of control. In epic tales, goddesses were exalted, yet their stories often reinforced cautionary themes. Power came with obedience, rebellion invited ruin, and the divine feminine was to be both admired and restrained. Legal texts, such as the Code of Hammurabi, formalized these restrictions, dictating behavior, inheritance, and social standing with rigid precision. Even myths celebrated female divinity while simultaneously embedding the expectation of subservience. By intertwining devotion with regulation, The Mesopotamian system created a society in which women were constantly reminded of their dual roles, vessels of sacred power and subjects of earthly authority. This codification ensured that oppression was not arbitrary, but sanctified, embedded, within the cultural and spiritual consciousness of generations. The subtle messaging within these texts taught women that defiance was both sacrilegious and dangerous, while obedience guaranteed temporary favor and survival. Hymns that praised goddesses' strength were accompanied by rituals emphasizing submission, reinforcing the paradox at the heart of the sacred feminine, exalted in the divine imagination, yet constrained in reality. Over centuries, these narratives and laws left an enduring imprint shaping gender dynamics, religious practice, and societal expectations far beyond the temple walls. The power of words, of written myth and law, became another mechanism to perpetuate control, ensuring that reverence for women never equated to true freedom, and that the cycle of domination and veneration continued through the ages. When we look beyond Mesopotamia, striking parallels emerge across other ancient civilizations, revealing that the systematic control of women in sacred contexts was far from isolated. In Egypt, priestesses of Isis navigated hierarchies that, while appearing empowering, constrained their autonomy under the gaze of male religious authorities. In the ancient Near East, Sumerian and Akkadian societies mirrored the patterns of ritualized subjugation, blending veneration with coercion in ways that blurred devotion and domination. These civilizations often shared codified laws, mythological narratives, and ceremonial practices that reinforced gender hierarchies, demonstrating a recurring strategy. Exalt the feminine in symbolism while constraining it in practice. Comparisons reveal that sacred marriages, ritualized obedience, and patriarchal oversight were not merely cultural quirks, but systemic tools to consolidate male authority across the region. Women, whether revered as goddesses, prophetesses, or priestesses, were consistently placed within frameworks that limited freedom and dictated conduct, illustrating a disturbing continuity in how societies manipulated spirituality to enforce social control. By examining these patterns, we recognize that the exploitation of the sacred feminine was a structural phenomenon, embedded into the very fabric of religious life. The Mesopotamian example becomes a lens through which to understand broader historical trends. The paradox of reverence coupled with oppression, the public exaltation paired with private constraint, and the ways in which spiritual authority could be weaponized to subdue those it purported to honor. These recurring shadows across civilizations remind us that the history of women in sacred spaces is marked by a tension between veneration and domination, a tension that transcends geography and time, echoing through the rituals and institutions of antiquity. As we confront the unsettling realities of Mesopotamian cults, it becomes clear that understanding these histories is not merely an academic exercise, but a mirror reflecting the complexities of power, devotion, and gender that persist even today. The sacred feminine, exalted in myth and ritual, yet constrained in practice, serves as a testament to the ways in which society can sanctify control while masking exploitation. Recognizing the deliberate manipulation, the rituals that bound women both physically and psychologically, and the intricate systems of obedience and punishment, allows us to reevaluate how reverence can be weaponized and how autonomy can be subtly denied in the name of tradition or spirituality. These lessons resonate far beyond ancient Mesopotamia, offering insight into the universal struggle for equality and agency, and reminding us to question narratives that blend honor with oppression. By revisiting these dark chapters, we not only preserve the memory of those who suffered, but also cultivate awareness of the mechanisms through which power can be misused under the guise of the sacred. History, when examined with unflinching honesty, empowers us to recognize and resist similar patterns in our own world. The story of the sacred feminine in Mesopotamia is a chilling yet instructive saga, a cautionary tale that urges reflection, critical thought, and vigilance. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and watch the next video to continue uncovering the hidden truths of ancient civilizations and the shadows they left behind.